Hey, this is Bunny, and today while I'm painting this stag, I want to talk about one of the cornerstones of Dungeons & Dragons lore. Stags, great elk, sacred deer, and all the mythic weight they quietly carry across editions. They don't usually get flashy monster entries, they're rarely the center of an encounter, but they show up again and again in ways that matter. And for the purposes of these videos, they're kind of perfect because they matter. One of the reasons stags work so well in D&D lore is that they're creatures players already understand instinctively. You don't need a long explanation of what a stag represents. Even outside fantasy, we associate stags with watchfulness, grace, and quiet authority. D&D leans into that shared cultural understanding and then layers magic on top of it. The result is a creature that feels ancient without needing exposition, and powerful without ever needing to posture. In a game full of monsters that roar, threaten, and announce themselves, the stag does the opposite. It appears briefly, it watches, it leaves. That restraint is intentional. Many D&D texts describe stags as being present only when the land wants to be seen. They are less a random encounter and more a punctuation mark in the environment, a way for the setting itself to acknowledge the players. That's also why stags are rarely described as solitary accidents. If you see one, it's because you were meant to. If it lets you see it, that's a choice. D&D repeatedly reinforces the idea that a stag's presence is permission-based, not ownership-based. The land allows you to witness it, not claim it. At first glance, stags in D&D seem pretty simple. They're animals. They're prey. They run fast. They live in forests, and adventurers sometimes hunt them for food. But that's only the surface layer. And D&D almost never leaves things at the surface. From the earliest editions onward, deer, especially stags, are written with just enough reverence to suggest that they are watching, aware, and more important than they first appear. In basic and early editions, deer and elk are part of the natural landscape. They are signs that you're in untamed land, far from cities and farms. Seeing a stag isn't an encounter so much as a signal. You're somewhere old, quiet, and alive. Even then, they're described as unusually alert, quick to flee, and difficult to surprise, which already separates them from more mundane animals. Early Dungeons & Dragons didn't always spell things out, but it really didn't need to. In 1st and 2nd edition especially, a lot of the magic lived between the lines. When a stag was mentioned in a wilderness description, it wasn't just filler. It told the dungeon master that this land was still alive, still functioning on its own terms. A forest with deer was a forest not yet broken. That distinction mattered. A forest without wildlife was often implied to be cursed, overhunted, or unnatural. A forest with stags was balanced. That subtle contrast trained players, over time, to associate stags with health and stability. Not danger, but warning signs if they vanished. Even when the rules treated deer as mundane animals, the storytelling treated them as indicators. If the deer fled suddenly, something was wrong. If they watched instead of running, something was very wrong. That unspoken language carries forward into later editions, even as the rules became more explicit. As the game evolves, that quiet importance deepens. Stags become less about hit points and more about meaning. They're not aggressive, but they are never insignificant. When a stag appears in a story, it's often there to mark a boundary between civilization and wilderness, between safety and danger, or between the ordinary world and something sacred. One of the most important developments in D&D lore is the rise of the giant elk, sometimes called great elk or elder stag, depending on the source. These creatures are consistently portrayed as more than animals. They are intelligent, perceptive, and deeply tied to the land they inhabit. In several editions, they understand spoken languages, and in older material, they are sometimes capable of speech. Giant elk are often treated as the elders of the forest. Not rulers exactly, but witnesses. They remember when trees were young. They remember paths that no longer exist. And they don't give their trust easily. A druid encountering a great stag isn't meeting wildlife. They're meeting a neighbor, or possibly a judge. That theme shows up again and again. Stags as judges rather than fighters. When they charge, it isn't rage. It's decision. Dungeons & Dragons lore frequently frames a charging stag as the wild saying, "No more. You've crossed a line. You've stayed too long. You've taken something you should not have." Great stags and giant elk also introduce an important shift in perspective. They are among the first creatures in Dungeons & Dragons that blur the line between animal and NPC without fully crossing it. They aren't humanoid. They don't build societies, but they remember, they choose, and they judge. That liminal status makes them uniquely powerful narratively. A great stag doesn't negotiate like a person, but it can refuse. It can withdraw. It can allow passage or deny it. Those choices give dungeon masters a way to express the will of the land without turning the forest into a talking character. Some editions describe great stags as long-lived or effectively ageless unless killed. Others imply reincarnation, that the spirit of the forest simply finds a new body when the old one fails. Either way, the message is the same. The land outlasts individuals, and stags are one of the ways it does so visibly. One of the most iconic stag forms in Dungeons & Dragons adjacent lore is the white stag. Sometimes it has no stat block at all. Sometimes it's just an entry in an adventure description, a rumor, or a story told by an NPC. The white stag almost never exists to be fought. It exists to be followed, avoided, or perhaps misunderstood. White stags are omens. They appear at liminal moments: dawn, dusk, seasonal transitions, times when the veil between the worlds is already thin. They often leave no tracks, or their tracks vanish inexplicably. Following one of these guys usually leads characters somewhere important, whether they meant to go there or not. Hunting or killing a white stag is almost always a mistake. Across editions and across settings, this act tends to bring consequences rather than rewards. The land may sour. Fae may turn hostile. Druids may withdraw protection. The message is consistent. Some lives are not meant to be taken, and the wild remembers when you do. The white stag, in particular, occupies a space that's closer to myth than monster. It doesn't exist to be interacted with, not mechanically. It exists to pull players out of a tactical mindset and into a narrative one. Seeing a white stag is rarely about what you do next in combat. It's about what you choose not to do. Many D&D adventures use white stags as tests without telling players they're being tested. Do you chase it? Do you leave it alone? Do you assume it's prey, or do you assume it's something more? The consequences of those assumptions tend to echo far longer than the encounter itself. White stags also reinforce the idea that not all rewards are tangible. Sometimes the reward is passage. Sometimes it's knowledge. Sometimes it's simply not being punished. D&D doesn't always say that out loud, but it shows it repeatedly through how white stags are treated in the world. As D&D formalized the Feywild, stags became even more strongly associated with Fey energy. Fey stags are often described with antlers like branches, vines, thorns, or even crystal. Their eyes may glow softly or reflect starlight. Their hooves sometimes don't quite touch the ground, as if they're only partially present in the material world. These stags aren't just animals living in the Feywild. They are a part of it. They may guard crossings between worlds, acting as messengers for Archfey or serving as living symbols of seasonal courts. A stag tied to the summer court feels different than one tied to the winter court, even if they look similar at a glance. In some stories, powerful Fae ride great stags rather than horses. This isn't about speed or strength, it's about alignment. A stag mount implies harmony with the land, not dominance over it. The rider doesn't steer the stag, they move together. In the Feywild, stags often serve as living landmarks. Their presence marks territory more effectively than walls or borders. If a Fey stag is seen repeatedly in a region, it usually means the land belongs to someone. Not in a legal sense, but in a narrative one. It has been claimed by story, by magic, or by memory. Fey stags also complicate the idea of pursuit. Chasing one rarely results in capture. Instead, the chase itself becomes the point. Time stretches, paths loop. The stag remains just ahead, always visible but never quite reachable. In D&D terms, this is the Feywild asserting its rules over mortal expectations. Some lore suggests that Fey stags don't experience time the same way mortals do. They may remember events that haven't happened yet, or respond to actions that players haven't yet taken. That strange causality reinforces their role as creatures of fate rather than flesh. Divine associations with stags run quietly but consistently through Dungeons & Dragons lore. Natural deities, moon deities, gods of renewal, and gods of sacred hunting are frequently linked to stags, even when it's not spelled out directly. A stag might appear as a divine messenger, a test, or a temporary avatar. In older lore especially, meeting the gaze of a stag that doesn't flee is considered significant. It may mean the character is being judged. It may mean they're being acknowledged. Or it may mean something is watching through the stag's eyes. Divine stags often blur the line between symbol and incarnation. A god appearing as a stag isn't disguising themselves. They're expressing an aspect of themselves that words can't capture. Power restrained, authority observed rather than enforced, presence without conquest. In several settings, shrines to nature deities are deliberately built along game trails rather than along roads. The implication is that the gods walk where the stags walk, not where civilization carves its paths. That visual connection reinforces the idea that divine attention follows balance, not dominance. It's also worth noting that divine stags are almost never solitary by accident. If they are alone, it's meaningful. If they are accompanied, it's intentional. Their movements are always read as deliberate, even when their motives are opaque. Druids, unsurprisingly, have one of the strongest relationships with stags in Dungeons & Dragons. In many traditions, stags are seen as mere equals, not teachers, not servants, but companions in stewardship. Killing a stag without need is often treated as a spiritual failing rather than a crime. Some druidic circles view a great stag as a kind of spiritual anchor. As long as the stag lives, the land is balanced. If it sickens or disappears, something is wrong. This idea shows up repeatedly in adventures where the corruption of the forest is mirrored in the fate of its sacred animals. Rangers, too, are often defined by how they treat deer. A ranger who hunts recklessly is usually portrayed as inexperienced or careless. A ranger who understands when not to hunt earns respect from the wild, and sometimes protection that they never realize they're receiving. Stags also serve as guardians in a more subtle way. They block paths without attacking. They stand silently in clearings. They lead travelers away from danger toward places they were meant to find. In D&D, not all guardians use violence. Some simply redirect. For druids especially, stags represent restraint as a virtue. Strength is not shown through control, but through refusal. Refusal to overhunt. Refusal to expand endlessly. Refusal to bend the land until it breaks. This philosophy shows up in how stags are written. Powerful, capable, and yet almost always choosing not to escalate. That idea quietly challenges players' expectations. In a game where power usually means doing more, stags embody power as doing less. Knowing when not to act, knowing when to leave, knowing when to simply watch and remember. Rangers who learn this lesson tend to survive longer, not because the land protects them actively, but because it stops opposing them. That neutrality is its own form of mercy. There are darker reflections as well. Blighted stags and shadow stags or cursed deer appear when the land itself is wounded. These creatures are rarely evil by choice. They are symptoms. Their antlers may rot, their eyes may burn or hollow out, and their presence is unsettling rather than frightening. What makes these corrupted stags tragic rather than monstrous is their dignity often remains. They don't snarl. They don't revel in destruction. They endure. And encountering one is meant to hurt emotionally because it represents something that should never have happened. Across all editions, stags are rarely framed as obstacles. They are boundaries. They don't stop players by force unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they signal where stories change direction. Cross this line and the tone shifts. Ignore the warning, and consequences follow. That makes stags especially valuable for dungeon masters who want the world to feel responsive without becoming punitive. A stag doesn't punish, it observes. It gives players a chance to choose differently. And if they don't, the land responds, not out of anger, but out of necessity. This consistent portrayal across decades of D&D material is what gives stags their weight. They don't need mechanics to be respected. The game teaches players, slowly and repeatedly, that when a stag appears, it's time to pay attention. Across editions, settings, and storytelling styles, stags consistently occupy the same narrative space. They are power without cruelty, authority without domination, strength rooted in restraint. They don't conquer the wild, they embody it. That's what makes them such a natural fit for the Gentle in the Wild playlist. They aren't gentle because they're weak. They're gentle because they don't need to prove anything. When they act, it matters. When they watch, it matters. And when they leave, it matters most of all. That's it for today. Let me know in the comments what your favorite quiet or overlooked Dungeons & Dragons creature is, or if you've ever used a stag in a meaningful moment in your own game. I know I have. I hope you'll be back with us next time for more lore, more miniature painting, and more stories from the universe of Dungeons & Dragons. Bye!